Okay. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending where you are. And this is really great that we are starting a new section of the panel 5, actually, of the 7th annual China Global Think Tank Innovation Forum. So this is the 7th year we're having this think tank forum, and actually we, since this morning we had already 5, and including the opening ceremony with the 5 section already, and so this is great to continue our dialogue. We had a section cover China-U.S. relations. We had a section cover China-Asian, part of the with the Asian countries, and then we have a section covered. Last section was covered China and modernization, and of course this one we are covering the China-European relations. So it's really very honored for me to organize this prestigious forum that we are talking about. So welcome to the 7th China Global Think Tank Forum, and so also we are actually very honored and to have this section which titled "Revive China-European Think Tank Exchange in Hard Times." We hope the hard time will be over soon. So good news is I think China is turning around, and we are seeing the China lifted the lockdown on COVID in many fronts. We are seeing the economy is going to bouncing back, and things could be resumed exchanges, person-to-person exchanges, and the mobility of China reopening in 2023. So that's really great for our exchanges and dialogues. And so I think that I just come back also from last month. I was in Berlin, in Brussels, in Paris. And of course, in this summer, I was there also. So it's really great to see a lot of you there, and also now again online. And so basically, this section we had 1 hour. We want to cover a few subjects regarding the area. So basically we are going to assessing the China-EU relations for 2023. Because in light of the Chancellor Scholz's visit, so what about cooperation between China and the EU in the year ahead? What proposal can we make? Can we suggest? And also the China-EU economic cooperation, and also in light of the U.S.-China relation, because we are in this triangle relation, how can we really maintain some level of the independence, and how we can and work together? And also the last item I would like to also seek your opinion is that how can we all work together in the years ahead? We planned some meetings. We are working currently with EPC. We're also with Aspen, with Global Solutions. So we have all the great minds are here. We can, and also European Asian Center. So let's all talk about that, and we can. We have also Dr. Trey, who is a great expert on China-EU relations. So I would like to maybe officially introduce our distinguished panelists. I'll just follow this order here. So we have John Christopher Barr. He's the founder and CEO of Global Compacts, and also member of the executive board of Aspen Institute, France. And we have Mr. Dr. Cui Hongjian. He's the senior fellow and director of the Department for European Studies, China Institute for International Studies, which is under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's also a non-resident senior fellow of CCG. And we have Dean Chun, and he's the director of Center for European Studies, Fudan University. He's joined us from Shanghai. And of course, we have Marcos Engels, Secretary General of the Global Solution Initiative, which is a great G20 think tank based in Berlin. And we have Ambassador Pete Steele. He's the chairman, Europe Asia Center, based in Brussels. And last but not least, we have Fabian Zulek, Chief Executive, European Policy Center, a very prestigious think tank that we have been in partnership with. So I'll start with this, this running order, maybe just for the convenience. And I know that John maybe, have a bit tight schedule, but why don't I start with you? So what do you think about the issue we mentioned? And also we look forward to the meetings in Berlin and Paris this next year. We hope that we can make things happen, and also in Brussels. So CCG will take a lead on that and visit those three places. As always, EPC, we've been discussing that as well. And let's get something concrete. But let's get your overview and how can we cooperate and what are the proposals? John Christopher, please.
Thank you, Henry. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to take part into this panel. I must apologize in advance because unfortunately I will have to leave right after my short remarks because of a previous commitment. So I will, in a way, go straight to the point, and I think it's very timely actually to put this topic on the need for reviving the China-Europe think tank exchange. It is indeed almost vital at this point to revive those relationships. And I think we certainly all agree that during those last 2 or 3 years, because of the lack of direct interaction, but also for many other reasons, the relationship between Europe and China have somewhat deteriorated for good or for bad reasons, but they have actually badly deteriorated, mostly for political reasons. And I don't want to go into too much details, but of course, we all have in mind, from the European perspective, the way the COVID management, the mask diplomacy, human rights issues, China support, or somewhat some support for Russia. And I think this has created some sort of frustration among Europeans. And even so, the economic relations have remained very close and very strong. In 2020, I think China became the EU largest trading partners for goods for the first time, surpassing the US. Still very good, and there is certainly a need to revitalize, and reinvent the relationship between Europe and China. There is 2 interesting studies that just came out. One from the European Parliament Research Service that published a study. It's a survey made with the 200 most prominent think tanks and research centers in Europe that's working on a relationship with China, and which have defined the priorities areas for the common decade. And I think we can find some interesting element there. For instance, the topic for cooperation for climate and sustainability has been identified as one of the priority areas, but also reducing supply chain dependencies and protecting intellectual property. There is also a very interesting study that was published just 2 months ago by the German Marshall Fund, which is the Transatlantic Trends, which shows that actually there is still, among the public in Europe, a great openness for engagement with China. So I think the situation is quite contrasted. The door is still open, but in a way, and that would be my last comment, but which is the main, let's say, political focus, is that we are in a way at a pivotal point. I think we need, particularly in the perspective of the end, hopefully, touching wood, in the next few months of the conflict in Ukraine, there can be an acceleration in one way or another in the remaking of the world order and the coalition and the structure of the world. And I think this is a very important moment where Europeans can still move on one side or the other. There will be a very strong pressure, particularly from the United States, for eventually re-accelerating, revitalizing the tension between the West and China. Europe is certainly not very keen for going that way. Europeans still have in mind that in 2 years' time, there will be general election in the United States, and that everything can change again. You know, there is today a very strong focus on the transatlantic coalition, but it can change very rapidly. And also, I think, you know, there is still a very strong sort of trauma here in Europe, remembering a divide of the world. I don't think that Europeans are keen and willing to re-establish a Cold War or a divide of the world in two camps. I think there is a very strong awareness, a very strong willingness to build or to rebuild, to reinvent a multilateral system. And I think, you know, this is why it is extremely important at this point in time to revitalize the relationship between Europe and China with, in a way, no compromise, in a very frank and a very open way. I think it's also very important to understand that, and this is one of the key messages that emerged from this survey that I just mentioned before, is that Europeans are very keen to have the EU as an entity also being the counterpart for the discussion with China, instead of having some sort of a China one-on-one relation with countries in Europe. I think this is quite important that China acknowledge and understand that Europeans are very keen to speak with one voice, even so it is not easy. And we have seen even lately some issues about that. But I think it is also up to the Europeans, you know, to speak with one voice. But in a way, my message is to say the situation is open, and we are in a way at a pivotal point, and we should not miss this opportunity to re-engage and to build or to rebuild trust and mutual engagement.
Great, thank you, JC, for your excellent opening remarks. I think that was really you know, well received. I think that Europe is in a very special position, and European Union is the one of the largest economy in the world, and of course, I think EU maintains certain strategic independence is really highly relevant. One thing I can see is that, of course, we had many decoupling and you know, from the US, but we really haven't seen that from the EU, because Germany and France and many European countries not interested in that, in decoupling. So we have to, you know, support the multilateral system and of course the global trading system as well. And I know you have a lot of experience. You worked with the United Nations, World Bank, think tanks. So it's really important that you have your thoughts, you know, to share with us. So thank you, JC, for your very very open remarks. Now I'd like to have a Chinese colleague, which is Dr. Cui. You know, you've been studying monitoring the China-European relations, and also you've been, affiliated with the think tank in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and of course, you have been lived a board, work in the embassies, and now you've been really very knowledgeable about Sino-EU relations. So, what's your take on this Sino-EU relations, and what can we expect in 2023 and beyond? So, Dr. Trey, please.
Okay, thanks, Chair, and also thanks to the CCG for organizing this. Very good. Conference. But of course, I hope it's just the last one. Before we go back to a normal face-to-face communication. Indeed, as we know, if we just try to describe the current situation for China-EU relations, I would like to say to stabilize these relations will be very, very important task for both two sides. As we know, recently, the high-level exchange between China and the European countries, between China and the European Union institutions, deliver a lot of positive messages. Because as we know, in the past 3 years, the relations between China and the EU suffered a lot, not only because of COVID-19 and also Ukrainian crisis, and also some misperceptions, especially from the European side on China. So now I think that from now on, and also from the end of this year and the beginning of next year, hopefully there will be more positive messages from both two sides. We need to have some more restart of mechanisms or some exchanges and all-round cooperations. So when something happens in that way, certainly we can find out more and more resilience for the relations between China and the EU. And also second issue, I think that we need to try to create a more favorable environment for these relations. We should not make some more troubles to these relations. For example, some days ago, we had a talk with some even senior scholars from European side. A little bit of disappointment for me is some people are still looking for some I think unfavorable issue like Taiwan or some other. I think that the Taiwan issue should not be on the table between China and the EU. I think that for China and the EU, we need to have some more significant thing to do. We should not just, criticize with each other on the basis of any emergent event like that. So I think that we, especially for think tank, we should try to find out more consensus to create a favorable environment for both two sides. The third is how could we try to refocus on economic, trade, investment, everything, cooperation. As we know, the next year will be very, very important, not only for China and also for European side. Now, European Union has been suffering from energy issue and some inflation, and even its divergences with Washington on so-called the action from Washington in the name of reducing inflation. So how could the European Union, most of the European economies, try to achieve development, GDP growth? I think that would be the for most of the economy. So on this regard, and the EU, we do have to get corporations. So I to have some more focus on trade and try to find out a way to help the CAI, to have its real meaning, to have its real value for China and Europe development. I think all of these priorities, we need to take it in the mind. But finally, I think that the next year also very important for European side to go back to a peaceful environment. So we need to find out the end of the current crisis in Ukraine, which I hope that would be another kind of a growth point in the cooperation between China and the European Union. Now, European countries, European Union are talking about the issue of the rebuilding of Ukraine in the post-crisis era. As we know, China is also important trade partner with the European Union and also a very important economic partner with Ukraine. So I think we do hope that we can have some new space or new potential for this cooperation between China, European Union, Ukraine in the frame of the rebuilding of this country in the area after the crisis. So I should stop here. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Cui, and for your very constructive comments. I think you're right. I think China and EU could have many ways to collaborate. I think this how to revive this KAI is a comprehensive agreement on investment is between China and EU is very, very important. I can see that the Chancellor Scholz visit China, and then also China is open to the vaccine now from Germany, and also of course we see that for both Scholz and President Biden, President Xi emphasized that there should be no nuclear war and nuclear weapons cannot be used in those circumstances. So that's a very strong, I think, position on the current Ukraine-Russian crisis. So that's really we see a lot of consensus there, and so perhaps I have a European friend to speak after our Chinese friend. I have a Professor Ding after that, and so I'd like to invite Marcus. He's really a social scientist and with a very rich background in politics and international relations, international affairs. I know you one time you headed the office of deputy party chairman and also served as a spokesperson and campaign manager for Martin Schulz and also during his tenure as a president of European Parliament and SDP chairman. So very impressive, and you actually had many experience, and particularly the global solution that you've been leading and having this global solution conference on global governance are really impressive. So I had the opportunity to visit you twice this year, and would like to hear more. And I know how you see the G20 multilateral system, China-European relations, and we had also Colin Bradford this morning, West Dialogue, and how we can also work with you. So Marcus, maybe you can share some thought.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. Thanks to the CCG for having me, and thanks to all colleagues. This is a really important exchange, because I think we as think tanks should try to counter the tensions and conflicts in politics and between governments, and therefore our discussions is crucial. All panelists have been asked a number of questions, which I would like to address very briefly in my short introduction. And the first question was assessing the China-EU relations. And I see a trend at the moment in Europe, and that is the reason is China's relation with the so-called West are currently in a difficult situation. And one reason is the thesis that free world trade and close economic ties lead to a peaceful world has been shaken with the Russian aggression against Ukraine. The G7 countries have agreed on strong sanctions against Russia in response to the Ukrainian war and have set their sights on a rapid decoupling from Russian resources. And these reactions, these economic reactions, are increasingly being elaborated in Western capitals and in Brussels in strategic papers and concepts, and most of them are called strategic autonomy. And this discussion on strategic autonomy also affects the relations with China. And this is explained in the public discussions with the following arguments. They are not my arguments, but they are used in the public. And the first argument is the increasingly dependency on China's raw materials and technology is being assumed, as well as unfair obstructions of companies that want to do business in China. And the second argument, my dear colleague from China mentioned that already, is the geopolitical tensions in Asia, and Europe is irritated by that. And there's the fear that a military conflict could be possible in Asia, and people are scared of this. And this strategic autonomy discussion as a trend can promote, that's my fear, a deglobalization, which in the worst case leads to a multilateralism. And indicators for that trend are already seen in the Me First policy. We saw that in the United States with Donald Trump, with growing nationalism in many, many countries, and the collapse of international corporations instead of increasing number of like-minded alliances. And such a trend would be very, very bad news for global climate protection, for the fight against pandemic, and for overcoming poverty. So in my opinion, because the question is, what can we do as think tanks? In my opinion, the task of think tanks and of think tanks cooperation is to counter this trend by developing a new narrative of global domestic politics and a comprehensive approach for global problem solving. The second question was resume US-China climate talks. And again, a narrative of a global domestic politics is important for an effective climate policy, as also expressed by the Indian G20 slogan, One Earth, One Family, One Future. It is the common interest of all states and of all people to combat life-threatening climate change. And it is clear in that discussion, especially when you take into account the last 200 years, that the industrialized countries are responsible for the vast majority of CO2 emissions. And it is equally clear that per capita emissions in the G7 countries are much higher than in the emergency and developing countries. So this means a clear responsibility of the industrialized countries, in particularly for combating climate change, and also that the industrialized countries have to pay for climate loss and damages. And from my point of view, it was a great success during COP27 that especially in that field, in the fund of loss and damages, we witness a first progress. But having said that, I would recommend all of us to say it is, of course, wrong to overlook the fact that also the very fast-growing emergency countries are making an ever greater contribution to current CO2 emissions. Denying this makes the international climate negotiations much more difficult. So I see the second task of think tanks is to mediate in this dispute, and perhaps we have to develop a way to reconcile the historical responsibility for CO2 emissions, the per capita emissions, and the climate damage caused by nation states and their economies, also for the emergency countries. As I said before, the purpose must be to achieve a common perspective and a new dynamic in climate negotiations and not to insist on old arguments. The third question was the COVID exit and reopening of the Chinese government. China's opening up on COVID is, from my point of view, first of all, really good news. The Chinese government has responded to the frustration of many, many companies, domestically as well as internationally, as well as to popular discontent in China. Internationally, however, the radicalism from a zero COVID policy to dropping many measures has surprised. What the consequences will be is hard to foresee at the moment because the development of the pandemic cannot be limited to one region, but also always has a global impact. In my opinion, the task of think tanks is to develop global strategies for pandemic control, and this includes a global health strategy and its financing as a global public good. And of course, the question was, think tanks has changed in 2023. I hope, and I think it is really, really important that we will return to more physical encounters. It was great that Henry Wang was visiting us in Berlin. And I can say in that round that the Global Solution Summit on May the 15th and 16th next year in Berlin will welcome about 1,000 participants from all over the world on a very, very high level. And we will try to develop creative solutions, including to the questions I just raised. And of course, our dear friend Henry Wang, all colleagues from CZG, and you are all invited. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Okay, thank you, Marcus, for your very comprehensive and constructive opening remark as well. You know, you've been very experienced in running your think tank, and of course, you've been making a lot of good proposals. I think that multilateralism, climate change, pandemic, all those common threads that we have to work together are absolutely important. Now I'd like to have Professor Ding Chun. He's the director of the Center for European Studies at Fudan University, but he's also the Secretary General of the Chinese Society of EU Studies. So a very knowledgeable expert on China European affairs. So Professor Ding, your turn, please. I want to have one Chinese, one European.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. Thank you very much. Thank you also the CCG to invite me to this very prestigious conference. I will focus more on the point, China's COVID exit and reopening or opportunities for the European economies. So first of all, about the measures. Yeah, actually we know that on November 10th and also December 7th, the Chinese government issued 20 and also 10 measures to optimize the prevention and also control of the COVID-19. Actually, in particular, I have to mention, to these inboard personnel. The first is to cancel the circuit breaker mechanism for inboard flights. The second is to reduce the number of nuclear exit tests before boarding. And the third is to transfer important inbound business personnel to the isolation and also close the management area point to point. And the fourth is to adjust the positive criteria for inboard personnel. And the fifth, actually is isolation measures for inboard personnel has been adjusted for so-called 7 days of centralized isolation plus 3 days of home health monitoring to 5 days of centralized isolation plus 3 days of home isolation. All these kind of release measures, which I think has greatly facilitated the exchanges between the European and also Chinese personals, and is conducive to promoting the bilateral economic trade, investment, and also personal exchanges, which hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. Also on December 4th, we all know that delegation composed of the heads of the Zhejiang Provincial Department of Commerce and also entrepreneurs has already started a so-called 6-day European business trip, which is no doubt very, I think, positive news for us. Also, I think for the people from the European side, especially for business people from Europe to China, I think it's really a very good news. Like the person in charge of the enterprises participation in the activity said that a meeting in person is worth 1,000 emails. So that no doubt really a good news to both sides. Second, some words about actually the status quo of EU-China relations. As previous speakers include Dr. Cui has already mentioned that we all know that status quo of recent bilateral relationship between China and EU shows so-called the warm economy and the cold politics. And one of these is, very symbolic, is the free frozen of the ratification of CAI by European Parliament, and also we all know quite a lot of other, measures which actually give a very negative impact to the Sino-EU relations. But however, the bilateral trade and economic cooperation showed very strong growth. According to the statistics, from January to August of this year, bilateral trade and economic activities grow by 8.8%. And if we have a look of outwards FDI from both sides, which grow also by 121%, and the China-EU, Railway Express was also on increase. We all know nowadays, actually, the China-EU Railway Express has already reached about 180 cities and in 23 countries in Europe. We all know that nowadays, especially with the influence of the US Inflation Reduction Act, quite a lot of European investors has just moved to not only to US but also to China and to other countries. So which I will say that, especially with the visit of German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and also the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, to China, expressed the European side's opposition to decoupling and bringing the supply chain from China. Instead, they advocate that both sides should strengthen communication and also cooperation, reduce misunderstanding, also misperception, and promise to promote CAI, which would all be beneficial to bilateral economic and trade exchanges, especially as China eases COVID-19 control measures. And third point, which I want to say is, as think tank, I think we have quite a lot to do, especially with the ease measures against COVID-19, especially for the new year. We could do quite a lot of things. Well, first, I think both sides, especially at the platform of bilateral think tanks, we could consult both the policymakers of each side and the realities, especially in the fields of, economic and trade and investment, in discrepancy of both sides. Especially, for example, in our center, we have do quite a lot of empirical research about the discrepancy between China and EU. And also we calculate quite a lot of these so-called export similarity index and also ICA index. These kind of empirical studies could give quite a lot of support to support the bilateral economic relations, I think. Yeah. Second, I think we can also do quite a lot of work to promote or to bettering or to reduce the misunderstanding and the resistance between both sides to improving the atmosphere for bilateral cooperation and also public opinions. I think public opinions here is always playing a very important role for the bilateral relations. Yeah. And third, I think we can also give some suggestions to the policymakers, both sides, especially in the fields of such as climate change, such as the digitalization, RA, and also, provide consultancy to policymakers to how to improve the bilateral economic cooperation, especially, for example, how to implementation quite a lot of measures which actually already exist in the CAI, although the CAI is now frozen. But when we have a look at the details of these kind of points, which both sides have experienced 7.5 years, 35 rounds negotiated points, why we do not do these kind of very detailed and concrete measures to promote, at least at the economic fields or at the level of entrepreneur or enterprises, both sides. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Ding, and so a lot of good suggestions and analysis and very timely recommendations. Now I'd like to have Ambassador Steele. I mean, Ambassador Steele is a senior diplomat, a Belgian diplomat, has been holding diplomatic leading positions in Geneva, Hanoi, and Hong Kong, and you've been in this part of the world. So you have also involved with many companies and enterprises, and also it's great to also we met when I last time at Brussels. So it'd be great to hear from Ambassador Steele. What's your thing? You are the chairman of European Asian Center. So let's hear from you, Ambassador Steele, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much for also inviting us. We are talking from Ho Chi Minh City, which is more and more called again, Saigon. So, and I said to one of my colleagues, is there a better place in the world to talk about China than in Vietnam? So it is very interesting indeed to spend some time here in this amazing country. I have been ambassador here a long time ago, but I have seen a transformation here in a very short time. And the last visit I had was 6 years ago, and I see tremendous changes. And that's thanks to innovation, thanks to enterprises, thanks to good, stable policies. We are also the new kid in town, if I may say. The Europe-Asia Center is indeed pretty new. We only are in existence 2 years, but we are not our think tank is not our main focus, but we are happy to share our ideas on subjects as today's on EU and China relations. When I say the new kid in town, our focus is more on building platforms of exchanges and platforms of dialogue between Europe and Asia. And of course, China is one of our primary target countries. And we have been able the last couple of weeks to indeed relaunch a dialogue on particularly on culture. We have organized in Brussels and in London a major exhibition on the Song Dynasty paintings. And I must say, in all the sometimes political tensions we are knowing today, it is quite amazing how much interest there is for Chinese culture in Europe, and also, I'm sure, in China for European culture. But having said that, as an introduction, I was going through the newspapers, here in Saigon this morning, and I was struck by one of the headlines, and one of the headlines was, China is back on the international circuit. They were calling it the re-entry of China in the world, and it's not surprising that this re-entry is linked or connected to the lifting of the COVID restrictions in China. And also, if you remember, in November, we had the G20 summit in Bali. It was a very promising meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping, followed by also a meeting by the President of the EU Council, Charles Michel, in Beijing, and of course, Chancellor Scholz. And more high-level meetings are in preparation. Mr. President Macron is preparing now a visit to China. And I heard also that the Australian Prime Minister is very actively preparing a visit or a bilateral visit. So not only the lifting of the COVID restriction, but I see also that China is, as I said, your President Xi Jinping, he was recently in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. So this is a sign that there is something moving. Moving from the side of China, moving also from the side of the EU. And talking about EU-China relations, let me say very bluntly, I think the EU remains very much engaged with China. And if you look, we already mentioned, the trade, the economic activity. And the trade links as such continue to be very important. And China is the EU's most important trading partner. And if you look at all that, about 92% of trade is not at all concerned by the EU's strategic goal, what they call the strategic autonomy, to be more or less dependent, from China on technology, on strategic raw materials, and so on and so forth. So 92% of trade is covered by the normal trade rules which exist, the bilateral trade rules we have between EU and China, but also the multilateral trade rules, because China is a WTO member since the beginning of 2000. So this is a very important point, that the trading relationship is not so much affected by this strive for more strategic autonomy. Of course, what is important is in all that is environment. Europe needs China to be successful with this green transition. This is a very, very important point. How much we've put focus on the Green Deal within the European Commission. and our targets, which are very ambitious in Europe, to go to a sustainable economy, a very low or a zero CO2 footprint by 2050. This can only be achieved in cooperation, with countries like China, where they have indeed an enormous, I would say, know-how and technological know-how. So on the one hand, we want to be less dependent, I'm sorry, on China, but on the other hand, we need China, to tackle some global issues which are important for the sustainability of this planet, which is indeed climate change. So this is a very difficult and sometimes it creates tensions not only between China and the EU, but within the EU itself. So all this is very important as I see it. But of course, there is one caveat, if I may say so. And the caveat is the geopolitical situation in the world. And, all the hotspots, they were mentioned. I mean, it's about Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, which I find terribly unjustified what happened, what Russia did, this aggression to a sovereign, unprovoked country such as Ukraine. So that's one. Secondly, it's also about what is going to happen, in Asia. I mean, there are hotspots in Asia which needs to be tackled in a cooperative manner, and it's not only about the South China Sea, but also, the whole question of what is happening with North Korea. So those are a couple of ideas I wanted to put forward. And,
okay.
And so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Steele, and also lots of good analysis and also recommendation as well. And it's very valuable. I think we'll look into those as in our findings after our conference. Now I'd like to invite Fabian, Zulek, and he's the chief executive of European Policy Center. I mean, we know European Policy Center is a very prestigious think tank in Brussels, and we have been, CCG has been really very, fortunate. We had an opportunity to work with EPC, also together with, China International Institute of International Studies as well. So we've been working together for the last several years, and we want to continue that cooperation. But you've been based in Brussels, and you have a lot of contact with European Parliament and all the stakeholders there. You've been actually running this for almost 10 years at the EPC. That's very experienced. This morning we had our conference. One of our speakers was Richard Haas, from Council of Foreign Relations. He has been running Council of Foreign Relations for 20 years. So you've been half of his time. So let's hear from you, Fabian, please.
Well, thank you very much, and very good to have these exchanges. Of course, it will be better to do them in person as well. But for the time being, I think it's really important that we have these exchanges, especially to foster mutual understanding. Because I think when we are in what undoubtedly is a very challenging global situation, it is really important that we understand where the other side comes from, what is driving the thinking. And what I'm trying to do in my short remarks is really just to set out what I think is going to be on the minds of Europeans over the coming year, and how that will affect EU-China relations. I think what has to be recognized is that what will be on the minds of Europeans is Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, both in terms of the war itself, but also in terms of the consequences this has for a variety of different areas, including, of course, energy, cost of living, economic development in Europe. So this is going to be on the top of the agenda. It is a watershed moment for Europe. It does put into question the ideals of Europe in terms of mutual cooperation, in terms of economic interdependence, also leading to political cooperation. So it is a very important moment in European history. And that also means that the end of this war can only be an end where Russia does not gain from this aggression. So this is very clear for Europe that there isn't a balance between the two sides. We have an aggressor and we have a country which is defending its territorial integrity, its existence. So in the end, Ukraine has to win this war. And that is what Europe is going to support. And that will also influence its international relations. So in the context of that war, I would say one of the things which we have to try to avoid is that Europe is forced to choose sides, because in this moment in time, it is very clear that despite the differences the European Union has with the United States is still the predominant ally of the European Union, and it is still the security guarantor for Europe. So that relationship, in my mind, will not be questioned fundamentally. I think the second question attached to that is how much support is given to Ukraine, and how much support is given to Russia, also by international actors. And it has to be very clear from a European perspective. Russia's attack is not only an attack on Ukraine, it's an attack on the Western way of life, our values, our interests. So any support to Russia is also a support which is prolonging the war against our way of life. So that also, I think, is important. So does that mean the relationship between EU and China is going to get better? There was a question of, is there going to be a breakthrough, or are we going to muddle through? I think also we have to put the question, could it deteriorate further? Because there are also risks. And I think that depends on also identifying the opportunities where we can work together. And for me, the opportunities are, on the one hand, in terms of finding global common objectives. Europe is still committed to the global multilateral system, to the rules-based order. So trying to find a way of supporting the global rules-based order, I think it's very important. And within that, I think it's also, and it has already been mentioned by others, it is very important that we start building climate change in even more than we have done up to now. Because in the end, and I'm going to be rather blunt on this, we are collectively failing. And we have to recognize that we cannot keep going like we are going at the moment, because we are going to hand a world to the next generations which will become unlivable. And that cannot be the outcome of what is happening now. So our generation has an obligation to coming generations to ensure that we tackle climate change better. And what we have just seen in the COP process is not good enough. It cannot be the answer that we are looking for. So I think we have to work much more on climate change, and we have to start building it also in, for example, into trade. Trade has to become greener. That also means we have to have a discussion around the carbon border adjustment mechanism, around how we can measure these kind of carbon footprints of trade of goods being transported around the world. And it might also mean that we have to turn down globalization in some areas to protect the environment better. So for me, looking ahead to trade and investment, I think we have to recognize that you cannot separate trade and investment from all these other considerations. I think we are still going to see a positive increase in terms of trade and investment, but it will also be more conflictual in some areas when it touches what I would call Europe's 4 great transformations. The transformations we're going through: the technological revolution, the climate change revolution, our demographic change, and what now is added to that is this economic security dimension, energy security dimension. So trade and investment has to be seen within that context. And there, I think, and that's coming back to this kind of exchange, I think this is exactly where these exchanges are really important, that there's also an understanding of the other side's intent. Why are we doing the things we are doing? They are aimed at achieving certain objectives. Is there a way we can find where we share some of those objectives at the international level? And again, climate change is far too important to continue to neglect it as we are doing at the moment. So I'll end on that, but I'm very much looking forward to further exchanges and especially in-person exchanges. I think these discussions are even more important and better when you can do them face to face.
Okay, great. Thank you, Fabian. Yeah, for your also very stimulating and comprehensive input as well. And yeah, I think you're right. Because I think China and Europe, we have a long history, culture, and heritage. It's two very old civilizations. I think there's many things we're in common. And of course, you talk about this Ukraine. China has a very clear stand that sovereignty, territorial integrity of Ukraine is absolutely respected, and also China is also against any further escalation and not favor any nuclear usage as well. So I think there's a lot of message that China has been saying. So what I think you mentioned the climate change and the trade and all those things are really great, and I think that. As we hear from our European colleagues and our Chinese colleagues, I mean, Europe is not as same as America, of course. So I'm thinking of this trilateral relation, or even the G3 relations, that the 3 largest economy in the world really has to work together. But Europe has a very unique position. You have a strategic independence, and we have seen Chancellor Scholz and Michel. Charlie Michel, and very soon, Macron will be visiting China. So we see, as also Ambassador mentioned, that China has also launched a very active high-level diplomacy. We've seen President Xi has already had 40 bilateral meetings with different heads of state, since last November, G20, APEC, and recently at the Arab Summit, and of course Central Asia visit as well. So there's a lot of things going on, and so since we are running almost out of time now, I would like to maybe just 1 minute or 30 seconds each to see what we can do, concrete proposals to improve the China-EU relation, which I can start. Maybe I think about two, because since now China is lifted from COVID quarantine, and so we hope that we can revive this tourism. Because when I went to Europe, there's for example, in the Paris airport, there's Chinese signs of airport stations. There's Chinese visiting Paris and Europe. So let's revive that. Before pandemic, China has 150 million outbound tourists. Also revive the student exchanges, and we hope to welcome more European students coming to China. And so that's one recommendation I can have. The second is what about, let's revive the KAI, because after all, as Professor Ding said, we have 7 years talks into that. So hopefully we can do something on that as well. And thirdly, I think of is the, maybe think tanks. We are having several think tanks here. We have a JC, he's in Aspen. We have, Fabian, you had the EPC in Brussels, and Ambassador still also in Brussels, and Marcos, you are in Berlin. 4 think tanks already, 5 think tanks. Let's CCG, and would like to, engage. Maybe we can have meetings in mid next year and have some more active exchange. And we also welcome you to visit China. At least at the think tank level, we can fully resume our dialogues and exchanges. So I'd like to hear from each one of you very briefly, 30 seconds or 1 minute of exchanges, ideas, and proposals that we can submit to both leaders of EU and China for how we can improve relations in 2023. I'll start with Professor Tree, please.
Okay, last chance. I think that yes, we do have many reasons to have maybe more optimistic views about the next year. But of course, I think it's also a very critical time for think tanks. I mean, for both China and the European think tanks, we need to rethink what's the real job for the think tank need to do. Thank you.
Okay, Marcus, you're in Berlin, yes.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I do agree with most of what has been said already. I think we really have to overcome this debate of strategic autonomy. There are really planetary risks, climate change, pandemics, global health, and overcoming poverty, where we really have to work together. And this is our task, I think, and therefore I'm very delighted to be part of that dialogue. Thank you very much, Henry.
Great, thank you, Marcus. And Professor Dim, please.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. Yeah, why do not let's start from the think tank? I mean, think tank exchange.
Okay, good. That's very precise. We have to start first. Ambassador Steele?
Yes, thank you. As I mentioned, the Europe-Asia Center is a platform for dialogue and exchanges, and we believe certainly in the value of those exchanges today. As I said, culturally, tourism, you mentioned yourself, also the economic exchange is very important. Secondly, I think we also, and this is more political, I think we need restraint. This is a very diplomatic term to say, listen, we have to indeed to make sure that we don't make the situation worse. And that's why I plead for a high-level diplomacy, which I believe has started.
That's great. High-level diplomacy, more high-level diplomacy. We hope to more European leaders will visit in China and vice versa, and also even business. Let's have some business summit in European countries and China. We've been lacking those in the last several years. So Fabian, your last term. Yeah, thank you.
A lot has already been said, which I fully agree with. I think all this activity to enhance mutual understanding is extremely important. But I would also say concretely, maybe there are 2 areas where we can work for the future. One is what I already mentioned in terms of greening trade, and how can we actually do that concretely? How do we work out the measurements, the standards which are necessary for that? And I think think tanks can help to facilitate that dialogue. And the other one, I think, is also on how does the world react to future pandemics, and how can we improve the problems which appeared this time are not repeated when, unfortunately, the next one hits us.
Great, thank you, Fabian. I also think last one, maybe 2023, both EU and China can lift the sanctions we had on each other, that'd be a good way to promote CAI as well. So I think we are coming to the end of our discussion. We have a few minutes overrun, but it's really a very productive, very active discussion. And we have been the whole day and had many different themes, and we'll transmit those again into the social media and also into the public domain, and we'll summarize all your great points. And we certainly hope that we're going to meet you face to face, and also welcome you to visit CCG, in the foreseeable future. And so let's conclude here. And once again, I would like to thank all of you, and the very distinguished panelists we had. Actually, I want to mention the names again. Basically, we had J. Christopher Barr. He's the founder and the CEO of Global Compass, and a member of executive board of Aspen Institute. And Professor Cui Hongjian, he's a senior fellow and director of Department of European Studies, China Institute for International Studies, and CCG non-resident senior fellow, and Professor Ding Chun, director of the Center for European Studies, Fudan University, and of course, Ambassador Pete Steele, chairman, Europe Asia Center, and of course, Dr. Fabian Zulik, Chief Executive, European Policy Center. So thank you all very much, and also want to thank our fellows and people watch this online, and thank you all very much indeed. Appreciate your time. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
See you.
Thank you all for joining us today for the 7th edition of China Global Think Tank Forum 2022, hosted by the Center for China and Globalization. With 5 panels focusing on timely issues facing think tanks from many parts of the world, a book launch event, and a dialogue program featuring one of the oldest and most influential think tanks, we've had very productive discussions with leading think tank experts, policy scholars, and advocacy groups. We would like to thank all participants and online viewers and our partners for your support to the forum and CCG. We look forward to engaging with you on our future events and programs. Stay healthy and stay well.